Now, with all of these businesses coming and going, with all the fortunes being made and lost, with various panics and highs and lows and all of that, you're going to start to see a brand new concept. And that's going to be the theory of social Darwinism. Okay. Now, excuse me, the principles of social Darwinism, okay, what it's talking about here grew out of the theory of evolution, or Charles Darwin's natural selection, survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin had gone through, he had written his book when he went to after he'd been to the Galapagos Islands, and he went through and discussed that there were different creatures that they adapted to their environment, and those who were, the most fit tended to survive and thrive. They're based on that concept of natural selection. Basically saying that those creatures that had the best chance to actually survive, who were the most fit to survive, did. The concept of natural selection was that it got rid of those who were not suited to succeed. Darwin's theory was based on birds and the shape of the beaks for getting seeds and stuff like that. The idea was that if you had something favorable that was going to allow you to get better food or whatnot, then that would continue and would be a trait passed down to future generations. Whereas if you were not able to get the same food and things like that, if it was a hindrance of some kind, then that trait could pretty much end up with you being weeded out of the gene pool, essentially. So a lot of folks at this time, this was a fairly new theory back then, they looked at Darwin's theory and they started to apply it to other areas. Now, you had an English philosopher, a guy by the name of Herbert Spencer. There he is. And whenever you've got a name like Herbert Spencer and you've got sideburns like that, you know you're dealing with somebody who's not to be fooled with. Well, Herbert Spencer took the concept of survival of the fittest and decided to apply it to human civilization. His argument being that as time goes on, those civilizations on the planet which are the most fit would survive, would flourish, and would continue on. Those civilizations that were not fit would not. He could point to things like the fact that the Egyptian pharaohs were no longer a ruling civilization, or Rome had fallen, things like that. The idea being that if you were a civilization, and it didn't matter what civilization that was, if you were suited, if you were the most fit of all the others around you, you would continue on, whereas everybody else would fall by the wayside. Now, economists would go through and they would use this theory in regards to social Darwinism to justify something called laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire is a type of capitalism where it's really you're on your own to figure out what's going to happen. It is you as the consumer, it is your responsibility to make sure that what you're purchasing is really what you want. I mean, we go to the store today. If we go to purchase something that says 100% ground beef, we assume that it's 100% ground beef because we have laws regarding advertising. But back then, you could be told it was ground beef, and maybe it had beef in it. It might even be just ground beef. It's hard to say. But it could have cow, horse maybe, some pig or lamb, maybe a cat ground up in it, something along those lines. You were pretty much at your own risk when you bought things. And the idea here is that those businesses that were suited, that were fit enough to keep going, would survive no matter what. That the market would weed out those businesses that were not fit to survive one way or the other. So you're looking now at this laissez-faire capitalism. Basically, the argument was marketplaces should not be regulated. There should be no rules, no restrictions, nothing whatsoever. If you buy something and it turns out not to be what you intended, that's basically your problem. The Latin phrase would be caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. And this would apply to absolutely anything. It would apply to the meat you might be purchasing. It might apply to medicines. Essentially, if you were a businessman and you wanted to go through and basically just say that this will cure whatever and it didn't, well, that was the buyer's problem. And oftentimes, when you found out that somebody was, not being fully honest with what their product could do, sometimes those people got in deep trouble with a mob, and they would actually have to run out of town because a lot of the townsfolk might be after them at that point in time. So you do have the concept that the strong would survive. Again, this is the idea that those who are most fit to survive, who are most fit to exist and keep going in any kind of market would do so. Those who were not fit to survive would not. Those businesses would die out. You had a political science professor, a gentleman by the name of William G. Sumner, argued it this way. Said that success and failure in business were governed by natural law and should not be interfered with. That all the businesses that existed, they existed on basically the same plane. It was like law of the jungle. Those who could survive would. Those who were not fit to survive would not. And the argument was that this meant you would have better businesses available to the consumer. You would have leaner businesses, businesses that weren't as concerned about, fill in the blank. They were able to provide a better product to the consumer at a better cost. Of course, this also meant that there was no kind of regulation, as I said, and you could quite easily end up buying, shoddy or inferior merchandise of some kind. But the argument was that they're all governed by natural law, by the invisible hands of the market, and those would take care of the problems. Government should not be involved in any way, shape, or form. And so that gave us a new definition of success. Okay, if we're looking at everything through the concept of there's some kind of natural law, there is some kind of invisible hands that control everything, that you don't need the government involved in any way, shape, or form, this takes on a brand new meaning of success. It basically says that success or failure supported the notion of individual responsibility and blame. Okay, if you started a business and it succeeded and you made a lot of money, that was, you did all of that. That is your responsibility. If you started a business and it failed miserably and you lost all your investment, well, that was also your responsibility. It was your blame. Basically, it was the idea that success or failure were something that were out of people's hands. If you were destined, if you were fit to survive, you would. And as I've said before, if you were not, then you would not. This was also a point in time where basically if you were succeeding, if things were going well, riches or successes, this was seen as a sign of God's favor, that you were supposed to be doing it, that you had been chosen for whatever reason to succeed at what you were doing. But on the other side of the coin, poorness or failure, that was a sign of laziness or that you were inferior. Okay? If you started a business and you succeeded, that meant that you were a superior individual. If you started the same business and it failed, it was because you were inferior, essentially. You have to go through and look at it this way. Social Darwinism in regards to the businesses, we're looking at all of this was being governed by natural law, that it was going to work itself out the way it was supposed to work out. Government should not be involved. It would be a very, very cutthroat form of capitalism in which some people made fantastic fortunes and turned out a decent product. Some made a fortune and turned out an inferior product. And some people lost absolutely everything.